Welcome to Revolutions Reconsidered, a deeper dive into the American Revolution. This season, we're focusing on the podcast Worlds Turned Upside Down, and we're unpacking some of the sources, stories, and contributions that make up the show. I'm Dr. Lynn Price Robbins, and I'm joined by Dr. James Ambuske, creator of Worlds Turned Upside Down. Thanks so much for being here with us today, Jim.
Hi, Lynn. It's great to be back. Thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. And thank you for being here. I really enjoyed episode 3, which is titled The Triumph. And this explores the changing tide of the French and Indian War from favoring the French to favoring the British. But also, more importantly, the role of the indigenous peoples in bringing the war to an end. And this is something I think we don't talk about very much. So There's a lot of new information in this episode. And I want to start at just the very basic aspects of this war in how we refer to it. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned in the episode that the Europeans and pretty much everyone else calls this the 7 Years' War. But here in the United States, we call it the French and Indian War.
Right.
So I'm wondering, to me, this seems like we're kind of downplaying the power of the indigenous peoples, the Indians as we're calling them, and how they played, how their power and how they played both sides. There were some on both sides, because I feel like by calling it the French and Indian War, it feels like we're calling Indians one cohesive group on one side of the war. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. And I'll just throw out there as we get started, in Canada, they often refer to it as the War of Conquest, which this episode deals with as well. But I think you're absolutely right. The French and Indian War, which the Americans have called it since the 18th century, is kind of a misnomer, because it presupposes that the French and Indians were on one side, and as you rightly say, it also supposes that the indigenous people were one cohesive monolithic group. But we know that's fundamentally not true, and British Americans and British officials at the time knew that that was not true, because one of the things that we try to do in this episode is show how the Haudenosaunee, Six Nations Iroquois, the Lenape, the Delaware, and Shawnee, other peoples, are all making critical independent choices that shape the history of the war. And there are indigenous people who are allied with the French. There are individual towns within a greater indigenous nation that are allied with the French, and some are allied with the British. So to call it the French and Indian War misses almost everything, because it's convenient, right? It creates a nice little, these are our enemies. This is a nice way to sort of put a bow on that. But it misses the extent to which there are Native peoples allying with the British. There are Native peoples making their own decisions. And I think what also the name does is it implies that the indigenous people are subordinate to the French, and conversely, by implication, that indigenous people are subordinate to the British. But they, I think, as we talked about in episode 1 of our series, they really see themselves as working in parallel with these different European counterparts, not in a kind of subordinate relationship. And that's really the key. And that's, if you're going to be successful in North America, you have to understand those balances of power and how to manipulate those balances of power for your own interests.
That's a really great point. And I think what I love about this episode is that when I initially think of war, I think of battles and, maneuvers and flanking and all of these, things that you think about, you hear about, you read about. But this episode is really saying that more than anything else, the key to winning this war was diplomacy.
Right.
And the fact that the British came out on top, they won the war because they were more respectful toward the indigenous peoples than the French were. So can you share some of the examples of how diplomacy essentially drove the war?
Yeah, and so it's really critical. And, just by example, one of the reasons why the war goes so poorly for the British between 1754 and into the late summer winter of 1757 is that the Haudenosaunee decide to sit out the war because they are, essentially wanting to protect their homelands, wanting to protect their sovereignty. They want to see who's going to come out on top. And the issue of respect is a complicated one. I mean, I in some ways, it's not necessarily that one side was more respectful for the other, but one of the things we try to do in the episode too is show that how within each different European group, there are serious disagreements about whether or not they should even bother working with native peoples. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in New France, and one of the things we try to make clear is that indigenous people are absolutely essential to the survival of New France. Mm-hmm. The Marquis de Montcalm, who is a European-born officer, who becomes commander-in-chief of New France, has a very sort of traditional French noble attitude towards indigenous people, in that we don't really need them. The price that we have to pay to provide them with gifts, to maintain those relationships, are not worth it. We should really be relying on French honor and French tactics and French valor. Governor Vaudreuil, who is the last governor of New France, whose father was governor, who was born there, he is like many French Canadians. He understands what it means to work with native partners, and he understands that in order for New France to survive, you have to make that concerted effort. So there's this internal tension between different European cultures who are disagreeing fundamentally about how to work with native peoples, or whether to work with them at all. The British have the same problem. Mm-hmm. As listeners of the first couple episodes will know, General Braddock doesn't have the best track record of wooing indigenous peoples. Lord Loudon, who succeeds him as commander-in-chief, doesn't really either. Geoffrey Amherst, who will feature later in the series as well, is kind of notorious for his extreme dismissive attitude towards native peoples. But what colonial-born British subjects and British officials begin to argue successfully is that if we're going to win this war, we have to actually treat our indigenous partners with respect. Concrete example is that Sir William Johnson, who is the superintendent for Indian affairs of the Northern District, so essentially he's in charge of managing native relations on behalf of the Crown for the colonies north of the Potomac. Mm-hmm. He outlays 17,000 pounds in presents and trade goods to the Haudenosaunee, which, as we've established in our previous conversations, is a concrete measure of respect. It's not a payment. It is a signal of your valor. It is a signal of your worth. That helps reignite the Haudenosaunee relationship with the British. And then we get to 1758, as we'll talk a little bit about more here in a second. General John Forbes, who is just in terrible health and leads the army that eventually takes Fort Duquesne, he is rare amongst British generals in realizing through some practical experience that you cannot command native peoples, that they are, as the two-row wampum treaty would describe for the Haudenosaunee, partners in parallel, two rivers moving in the same course. Mm-hmm. And so if you're going to secure their support, you have to treat them like that. You simply can't treat them as if they are your subordinates. And that's one of the concrete ways that the British managed to recover. And then native peoples begin to see that it is in their self-interest to re-ally with the British, or ally with the British for the first time.
That's a fantastic answer, because we're going to talk about a specific example of a gentleman who sort of exemplifies this ability to adapt to culture and to basically practice diplomacy on the term, on not on their own terms, but on the terms of those who they're trying to sort of bring on their side. And so talking about Moravian missionary Christian Frederick Post, who's fascinating, and he has a journal that you can read online that is on Library of Congress, and thancfully is transcribed, because I did see some of his handwriting. And we'll just be thankful for transcriptions. But before we go into him, now, he didn't come to North America to be a diplomat. He came to be a missionary. So can you just briefly talk about what the Moravian mission movement was and why he was here?
Yeah, so the Moravian Church, Moravians, who many people will know in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, places like that, northern New York, Moravianism is one of the oldest Protestant sects. I think it predates Luther by Luther and his 99 Theses by something like 50 years or something like that. It originated in the Kingdom of Bohemia, which is in modern equivalent would now be the Czech Republic. And their emphasis is on sort of personal conversion to Christ and missionary work to help you along that path. And we begin to see in the early 18th century Moravian missionaries going throughout the world, but in North America, in St. Thomas, I think in the 1730s. And then in 1741, a man named Count Zinzendorf, who was a very famous leader of the Moravians in North America, co-founds the town of Bethlehem in Pennsylvania. And Christian Frederick Post comes in 1742 to be one of these missionaries. There's a lot of missionary activity in New York where they're missionizing amongst the Mohicans. And then in Delaware in particular, they are evangelizing and doing missionary work amongst the Lenape, or we would often call them the Delaware in English. So he establishes himself as an individual who is working with Native communities, who is attempting to convert them to Christianity. And in the process of that, he begins to learn various indigenous languages. I think, if I recall correctly, he definitely knows Delaware, of course, but I think he also picks up Shawnee and maybe one or two others. So he is a very talented linguist in this period and becomes a central figure in the story we tell in episode 3, The Triumph.
Absolutely. And he meets the indigenous peoples on their terms. So not only does he learn their language, but he learns their culture. He's respectful toward it, the clothing. In fact, I believe he is given at least 2 indigenous names. So he's so accepted that he's actually, given an indigenous name, which is a pretty significant deal for for someone who came in from, who's, just coming as a missionary, but they've accepted him that much. And so he goes from this to all of a sudden becoming a diplomat during the war. So can you talk about how that happened? And then, of course, you might want to do that through his most famous mission, which I think would make a great Hollywood movie. just calling that out. If we want more people to learn about this, another way to get people interested. But it's just a really, really fun story. So could you tell us a little about it?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the point, Lynn, that you raised earlier about how the French and Indian War is kind of a misnomer and diplomacy is central, because Post becomes what historians call essentially a go-between, or a kind of cultural broker. A historian named Jim Merrill writes about this in one of his books, and in particular a book called Into the Woods, or Into the American Woods, which is about Pennsylvania in this period. And these are people like Post who learn native languages, who immerse themselves in indigenous culture, who are often accepted by different nations and given indigenous names and honorifics. And they become this sort of central players who negotiate between sort of settlers on the frontier, or more importantly, political officials back in the colonial capitals, and what's happening in the West. They are absolutely essential in terms of building those relationships. And he is in Pennsylvania beginning in 1755, operating in one of these capacities, working with the Lenape, the Delaware, and other peoples and colonial officials, doing this kind of go-between work, this kind of this cultural brokerage where they are essential to both sides coming to some kind of understanding. In 1758, when John Forbes is given command of the army that is going to march against Fort Duquesne, the British know, and everybody knows, and the French surely know, they cannot hold Fort Duquesne unless they have native support. That was essential to the defeat that they inflicted on General Braddock in 1755. They cannot hold that fort unless they have indigenous support. So one of the key strategies of the British is, how do you peel away the Delaware in particular, and other peoples like the Ohio Seneca and whatnot, away from the French? Now, there are an important role that the Cherokee play in this process. The listeners will have to listen to episode 3 to learn that. But essentially what happens is a Delaware headman or chief named T.D. Esgung, who speaks for the Eastern Delaware, comes to Philadelphia, meets with Governor William Diddy, and says, essentially, is it possible to strike some kind of accord? And he brings two Delaware chiefs with him. Denny then decides to send Post, this cultural go-between, this cultural broker, back with T.D. Eskung into the West to talk with the Western Delaware, those who are more allied with the French, to convince them that the British want to talk and they want to have a conversation about ending the violence between the two, and at least, if not an alliance, at least some form of neutrality where the Delaware are not openly supporting the French.
Mm-hmm.
He meets, as you say, it would make a great podcast. Someone should do that. Please contact us. Maybe we can help. But he goes out into the Ohio country, this Western Pennsylvania, the Great Lakes region, to talk with Delaware peoples who are rightly very suspicious that this is anything but maybe a deception.
Mm-hmm.
They're not convinced that the British can treat them as well or treat them with the kind of measure of respect that the French have. Mm-hmm. If we think about the language of indigenous diplomacy, they were often referred to the French governor as their father, right?
Mm-hmm.
Signaling that the father takes care of his children. Right. Whether or not the British brethren then can offer the same kind of support is very suspect. And ultimately, he meets rightly with suspicion along the way, but he manages to convince enough nations that several Western nations and the Haudenosaunee mm-hmm. meet at Easton in Pennsylvania in October 1758 to conduct a treaty in which the Delaware agree, as they say in some of the speeches, to take the hatchet out of the heads of the English. Mm-hmm. It was a French hatchet, they said. We're sorry, we don't want war anymore. We want peace between our peoples. We now remove that hatchet and we bury it. And we have a wonderful quote in the episode from one of those speeches in which we sort of narrate that moment when the accord is struck after several days of diplomacy. And it's hard to imagine that that's going to happen unless, one, there's a willingness on the part of the Western Delaware and other peoples to mm-hmm. at least hear what the British have to say. And it's hard to imagine that that's going to happen without a man like Post, who right. is using the knowledge that he's acquired over the last decade to make a situation like this possible. And as you say, his journal's online, and it's a fascinating reflection of life in that period of religion, but also, more importantly, different native peoples and the relationships they have with white settlers like him.
Right. So it really seems like it's impossible to overemphasize the importance of the indigenous peoples in the outcome of the 7 year / French and Indian War.
Yeah. It's not giving anything away, really, but there's no way the British win.
Right.
There's no way the French lose unless indigenous peoples make certain choices that bring about those outcomes.
That's just absolutely fascinating. And hopefully everyone who hasn't listened to the episode will do so and learn more about this. I want to do a little turn, still focusing on culture, but my absolute favorite part of the episode was the song.
Right.
Absolutely beautiful. And it was a Gaelic poem that mm-hmm. was sung by scholar Michael Newton. Mm-hmm. Absolutely beautiful. And of course, it was not in English. So you do, you translate afterwards. But before we get into this, can you introduce the extended clip we're going to hear from the scholar Matthew Dziennik?
Right. Yeah, Matthew Dziennik, who's at the United States Naval Academy. He is an expert on the Highland soldier in the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. Wrote a really wonderful book called The Fatal Land. And what I've always loved about Matthew's work is he so effectively uses poetry, which is a real reflection of Highland and Scottish culture then as now. And so the clip you'll hear is an overview of how poetry in this period in the 18th century begins to change from much more of a communal enterprise into the work of individual poets, mm-hmm. but also how those poems begin to reflect what's happening in the colonies in a very significant way.
Great. Let's go ahead and listen to that clip.
There's an amazing corpus of songs in the Gaelic tradition related to America, related to military service, related to war, that all starts emerging in this period from the 7 Years' War through to the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and then sometimes even further into the late 19th century. Gaelic songs should be understood as the work of an independent poet. You are starting to see a transition in this period between the communal idea of a song. The song is a reflection of the will and desires of the community, to being a personal reflection on the part of the author. So that is changing. At the same time, there's enough tradition embedded in with that poetry to suggest that these songs are designed to appeal or explain or legitimize or justify a communal desire for something. And so these songs about America are filled with ideas about securing land. Sometimes, even explicitly dispossessing indigenous peoples of their territories and securing those to individuals. This is a kind of fascinating period because these songs, in many respects, are framed in a kind of traditional way. There's a kind of traditional Gaelic panegyric code, which is, for a poem to work, it has to do several things. It has to celebrate a particular leader. It has to celebrate the heroism of the Gael. It has to denounce the enemy. It has to emphasize the loyalty of the Gael to his clan superiors. That survives in a lot of this poetry. There's almost a kind of the poem is transferred to a new imperial context, but nothing changes. The leaders are still brave and honourable. The Gaels are still excellent warriors, and they're still loyal. But there's also some things starting to creep in these songs that are unique to a British imperial environment. You start to see the transference of loyalty from clan leadership to the British state, or something more abstract like the British Constitution. And that's a really interesting change.
All right, fantastic. So after we hear that clip, I want to talk a little bit about the poems that he's discussing. And my perception when I listened to him and when you translated the poem is that, yes, a lot of these poems are about loyalty, they're about honor, but almost in that way, they're romanticizing the struggles of war. It's almost like they're saying, it's honorable to be a martyr. You want to go out, you want to fight, and you will have honor. And so I'm wondering, is there any evidence in how successful these poems were and what they were trying to do? If you could talk about sort of the purpose of them, and then did they work?
Yeah, no, all great questions, right? Because, poetry is so central to Scottish culture, so central to national identity, as poetry has been to many cultures throughout time. But particularly in a Gaelic setting, it's a way of knowledge and culture transmission that is akin to what you would see in other societies, Greek poetry and the antiquity and whatnot, and trying to convey certain values. In this poem that Michael Newton sings for us in the episode, is a reflection of, I think, as you say, this idea that this be kind of an adventure, that it's also a reflection of the fact that Highlanders by this period are notoriously, great soldiers, or at least they're thought to be great soldiers. Of course, this is all happening about 10 years after the last Jacobite uprising. There's a romanticization that takes place of the Jacobites as formidable warriors who were willing to die for their king and country, and now they're willing to do so again for George II and his crown in the 1750s. How extensive it is as a reflection of the actual reality they face, it's really hard to say. And I think actually that would be a fruitful area of work, because one of the things Matthew Dziennik says after we introduce the clip from Michael Newton in the episode is, there's this, in the sense of the poetry, there's this martial excitement, there's this honor, there's this valor, but then, as Matthew says, it was probably really terrifying because some of these soldiers were just kids, probably the first time that they had held a musket or a bayonet, particularly in any kind of serious military capacity. And they are running, straight into French lines. They are dealing with an American way of war that's fundamentally different from the way that European armies fight.
Right.
European armies line up and they just shoot at each other. In the American landscape, both the French settlers, both British American settlers, but particularly indigenous peoples know how to use the woods and the landscape very effectively to their advantage, and they practice a kind of psychological warfare on their enemies that is hard to capture. There is a significant gulf then, I think, between what that poem speaks of about bravery and valor and excitement and possibility, and just the horrors of war, right? There's always this idea that war is glorious.
Absolutely.
And then people, and I don't have to say that to anybody who's actually fought in a war, like oftentimes it's really not.
Absolutely. And I can imagine these, young soldiers away from home and running essentially straight into, bullets and swords, that thinking about the, honor and loyalty might be the only thing to really sort of give you that bravery that would be so difficult to summon up.
Right.
When,
right.
Life or death situation, and all of a sudden it's not as romantic as you had thought it would be.
Right.
And another topic, so of course, war, loyalty, honor, that's very, very important within poetry, but they also wrote about emigration. In the 18th century, which I found very interesting. And there's one particular poem that I was hoping you would read a little bit of, because it mentions America a few times.
Yeah.
And it's called Song to the Exiles. So can you give us a little clip of that?
Yeah, so this actually comes from some of my own personal research. I think, as we talked about in an earlier conversation, my interest is in Scotland, in the American Revolution, and particularly immigrants. And so we'll get to some of the immigrants later in the series, but in keeping with the theme of poetry and capturing sort of the feelings and thinkings of Scots in this period and how that poetry begins to reflect the colonies. In the 1770s, or 1760s, 1770s, after the British win the 7 Years' War, spoiler alert, there's a significant migration movement from Great Britain, all the different kingdoms, but particularly Scotland, to North America. It's happening for many reasons. Part of it, why it's happening, is that the Scottish clan is kind of breaking down. There's also some economic hardships, and there's been some harsh winters by this point that have really compromised harvests and things like that. So in 1770s, many people are leaving the Western Highlands, the Western Isles, for a sense of a new life in America, but also with a sense of regret. Leaving their homelands, they feel as if they are going into exile. And so 1773, a poet named John McCordrum captures the feelings of Scots who are leaving the Isle of Skye, but also capturing what they have lost, but what they stand to potentially gain in North America. Still as British subjects. We're not talking about revolutionaries here, but people who are still loyal to the king. And he says in one of the last bits of the poem, "Go now, my lads, to a realm without want, abandon the land where rent's gone beyond you, for the realm of milk, for the realm of the honey, for a realm where you'll buy all the land you'll desire, for a realm without poverty, without blight or rationing, where you'll glean more than can last all of your days."
Wow.
So really a powerful reflection of what is happening in Scotland at that point, that the sense that the land has failed them, that they cannot afford their rents, that they have no choice but to go into an exile, to become what Scots still think of as the diaspora to this day.
Right.
But they can go to North America where they can get their own land. They don't have to rent it. They can theoretically get their own farms. They can live better lives than they could in Scotland. And the poems are capturing that. There's many, many like it. And it's a harrowing, but it's also a heartening reflection of what they understand or what they feel like is happening to them in this period.
Has your research shown that these poems were a little more reflective of reality? Or do you think they were giving too much of a rosy picture to make it sort of easier to handle the fact that they were being exiled?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. And I'll have to think, I'm going to think about that a lot longer after we've gotten off our conversation here. But I think in a sense, there is a bit of rosiness, but it's also, we have to keep in mind too, that this is a literature that's also existing within a wider context in which in the 18th century, many people are saying that America is the best poor man's country in the world. Like that's where that phrase starts. Benjamin Franklin says it. Some of the other immigrants that I've studied from Scotland will actually use that very phrase. Oh. So there is this sense of possibility. And there is in a sense, some truth to that. They can get land grants, and if they pay the rent, the quit rents, the taxes, they get to keep it, and they improve it. They are potentially no longer beholden to a Scottish laird or clan chief who is not performing his traditional duty of protection. And there is a potential that they can create new businesses or become part of the transatlantic trade in some way. So there is a real sense, I think, of both of potential, but also, possible romanticization as well. But then, of course, nobody can see what's coming in people can see what's coming in 1775 in a sense, right? But they don't imagine that the way that it's going to end in 1783.
Absolutely. So for those of us, the listeners or viewers to this podcast behind a podcast, let's say somebody wants to read that entire poem, or they want to, read some of the other Gaelic poems. Where can they go? Are they online? Are there books?
There are versions online, and there was a lot published beginning in the 19th century when, almost like in a kind of Homeric way, they decided to start writing these things down, and they became fixed, right? So there's poets by Duncan Ban MacIntyre, who are available online. Michael Newton, the scholar who read the Gaelic poem or sung the Gaelic poem in episode 3, he has a wonderful collection of publications that really, and a lot of them deal with Scotland and America, dealing with poetry and explaining it. And I think his work is very worth checking out. And then the edition that I just read from here is called Scottish Poetry 1730 to 1830, edited by Daniel Cook by Oxford World Classics, and that just came out very recently. So, Daniel Cook's edition, Michael Newton's work for sure, and then there are other poems and stuff you can find online as well.
Fantastic. And you said that, this is a part of your particular research. Is there anything that you wrote that we can look to about this topic?
Well, not in poetry in particular, although I will say that I recently published an article in Atlantic Studies called The Law of Loyalism, which is about a loyalist family, particularly the family of Lord William Campbell, who is the final royal governor of South Carolina, and his brother-in-law, Colin Campbell, who was a rich Charleston merchant, and the fight between their family members over Colin Campbell's estate in the post-war period in Scotland's Court of Session. So
that sounds very juicy and relevant pretty much for any age. Families fighting.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Never ends.
So we'll definitely look for that. So this has been a fantastic talk. It was such an eye-opening episode. I want to make sure you have a moment to share any closing thoughts that you want to make sure that you get across about that episode, about the war in general, or just anything that you want to make sure you share with the audience.
Yeah, I think, as we say in, I think, multiple episodes at this point, and we'll say it again pretty soon, is that the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, the War of Conquest, whatever you want to call it, the Great War of Empire.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Is the most important war in American history. Like, nothing happens the way it's going to happen from 63 through 1783, let alone through 1865, is going to play out the way that it does unless that conflict happens and the choices that various peoples make in its wake. And also to get across the point, as I think we've done quite successfully in our conversation today, Lynn, is that Indigenous peoples are central. They are key to the outcome of the war. And they, in very real respects, decide who's going to win it.
Fantastic. Well, you really can't end on a better note than that, and just the gravity and importance of what you're doing with Worlds Turned Upside Down.
Right.
And we'll absolutely look forward to episode 4. And what will you be focusing on for that?
Episode 4 is called The Empire, and it is about the victory that Great Britain has won and the consequences of that victory and how they try to make an empire that they had longed to make. But not everyone agrees that that is the way that things should go.
Fantastic. Well, definitely look forward to that. And thank you again for being here with us. And we look forward to more episodes of Worlds Turned Upside Down. Thanks so much, Jim.
Great, Len. Great to talk to you again. You've been listening to Revolutions Reconsidered with Dr. Lynn Price Robbins and Dr. Jim Ambuske. Revolutions is a co-production of Primary Source Media and R2 Studios, part of the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University. Our producers are Patrick Long, Jeanette Patrick, Lynn Price Robbins, and Jim Ambuske. Join the revolution by heading to primarysourcemedia.com or find Primary Source Media on YouTube. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.